One of the things that makes SSH such an incredible tool is that it allows you to tunnel any type of traffic. It doesn't have to be SSH traffic, but any type of network traffic through tunnels from one network to another. Now, in this nugget, we're going to learn to use the --L flag, which will allow you to create a forward tunnel to a remote host. We're going to do it with two different scenarios. One, we want to access a remote computer that is only listening on localhost. Now, if you're familiar with Linux, you know that localhost is its own complete network interface, and sometimes an application will only be listening on that interface. So we need to tunnel into it in order to gain access. And also, we can use it to reach inside a remote LAN if we only have access to one computer on the edge. Now, what that looks like in a diagram is, let's say Bob is right here, and Bob needs to access this computer, an application that's running on localhost only. Well, Bob can't use his computer and connect to it because localhost only listens internally on the computer. And so what we do is Bob takes his computer and SSHs into this server. So he's logged into this server with SSH. And then he can create a tunnel within that SSH command that will allow him to connect to a computer using localhost. So he's already in the computer, so now he can connect with localhost. And what it looks like on his computer is a separate port. So he connects to his computer on like port 8000, and what it's going to do is tunnel that so that it actually connects to this computer on whatever port we give it. So that's one scenario. The other scenario is, let's say Bob needs to get into this server over here. Okay, so this big server. However, on the remote network, he can only get to this server. So there's a forwarded port to go into this server right here. So Bob, again, will SSH into the only place that he can. So he SSHs into this remote network, and there's a port forward so he can get into this computer via SSH, but he wants to get over here to this computer up here. So what he does is he sets up a tunnel that it works the same way on his end. So on his end, he sees like, oh, I don't know, like port 2222. We just make up a port that isn't in use. And then he connects to this port on his computer, and it will tunnel inside that SSH connection and redirect it to this computer inside the network. And that's what he does. He sets up this initial SSH tunnel, and then he's inside, and he can, redirect once he's inside the network, kind of bounce off this one in that tunnel and connect to that other computer. Now, it's really a lot easier than it seems in the drawing here, so let's go and do it really quick so you can see the advantage of setting up SSH tunnels. So I've set up our lab a little bit like the description that we had earlier. This computer, Ubuntu 16.04, it has a web server installed, but it will only listen on localhost. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to tunnel into it so that we can access it remotely. And we can look really quick, because if we open this up, we'll be able to reach the web server on localhost, but remotely we won't be able to access it. So we can go http://localhost, and we'll see it says this is running Ubuntu, listening only on localhost. So back on our workstation here, if we were to try to go to Ubuntu, http://Ubuntu, it's going to say we can't get there. So we want to set up an SSH tunnel. So SSH-L for local port, and we want local port 8000, we'll say. And then colon, what the remote address is going to be, localhost port 80. And then what computer are we going to connect to? Well, we're going to connect to Ubuntu. So press enter. We have SSH key set up, so we've SSH'd into Ubuntu 16, and we've set up this port. So our local host, or our local port 8000, should connect to localhost port 80 on Ubuntu. So what happens if we try to go to http://localhost:8000? Press enter. Boom, this is running on Ubuntu, listening only on localhost. So that is that same web page that we reached over here, going through that tunnel on port 8000 to port 80 over there on localhost. All right, so it's a really easy way to get inside of a computer that you wouldn't normally have access to. Now we can press exit, and let's say we wanted to go through this computer to reach CentOS. So now we can say SSH-L. We're going to say port 8888 locally. And the remote server we want to go to is 172.20.0.5, which happens to be the IP address of CentOS. And we want that to go to port 80. And we're going to go through Ubuntu again. So hopefully this is clear what's going on. I'll press that, and sure enough, we're back in. Now there should be a tunnel going from our local port 8888 through Ubuntu 16.04 and redirect that to 172.20.0.5 port 80. So if we go to localhost 8888 on this computer, we should get the website that is being served on CentOS. Let's see. Sure enough, localhost 888 says I'm running on CentOS, listening on all addresses. So we went through this server and got to see the CentOS web page by going through that tunnel that we set up when we connected via SSH. So this is the local port that it's listening on, and this is the remote address and port that it's redirecting any traffic that we point at 8888. That's where it's pointing it to. So we could redirect it to the local host like we did up here the very first time, so that it points to itself, or we could point it to another computer on the network that it can reach. So that solves both of those scenarios that we looked at in our whiteboard. Now, it can be a little bit daunting at first to realize what exactly is going on when you set up these tunnels. But remember that SSH connection is just kind of this big tunnel that you can put things inside of, including something that goes all the way from this local computer here to this local port and have it redirect to the remote computer on localhost, or redirect it through another system on a network that this computer has access to. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.